Thank you, Dan. Hugh, this starts with the lockdown. Is that really where it started, or is that where you started it? I'm wondering if this stuff was sort of coalescing before, or if it was last year that got you onto it.
Yes, both. This book really is a distillation of, I suppose, well, certainly 30 years of social research, but the catalyst was the lockdown. What a gift from the gods a lockdown is if you're a writer. What is there to do except write? So I wrote it more quickly than I've written anything else. It absolutely flowed. In fact, a friend once said to me, if you enjoy writing something, people will enjoy reading it. So I hope people enjoy reading this as much as I enjoy it. It's the first book I've written where I really felt that it was a pleasure to write, and it was because of that double thing. It was highly contemporary. It was about what's happening to Australia in 2020 and what the effects of that are likely to be, but it was also taking this long view and looking at the perspective, from the perspective of previous research that was all about the value of neighbourhood, the art of belonging, what makes us tick. Why don't people listen? These are books from my past, some of which have found their way into this one as well, because it seemed to me the experience of first the bushfires and then the pandemic really amplified so many of the themes that I've been writing about and other people have been writing about for years, particularly the value of neighbourhood, the sense that we have when there's a crisis, that it's not just about me at all, that we share a common humanity, and we do, as Dan said in reading that little blurb from the book, we're prepared to make sacrifices for the common good at such times, not always at other times, we can talk about that, but all of this stuff suddenly seemed to make sense. It seemed as though all that stuff that's been swirling around in previous books and in my head and in my research reports suddenly was amplified by 2020.
So we'll try and get through as many of the chapters as we can in the time. The first chapter, Taking the Rough with the Smooth, I was intrigued by that. That for life to be interesting, for us to grow, it can't all be beer and Skittles. But how does that link to kindness?
Well, there are two things to be said about kindness, I think, in this context, Richard. One is we are talking about an innate human capacity. When it comes to kindness, we're not talking about something that has to be learned. Neuroscientists can now peep into the brain in ways that psychologists could only ever dream of, and start telling you what lights up, what areas of the brain light up under particular conditions and so on. And they've identified a thing they call the cooperative centre of the brain. Now, by the way, there is no competitive centre of the brain, but there is a cooperative centre. In other words, because we are members of a social species, it is absolutely natural for us. We are hardwired for cooperation, which means we are hardwired for kindness, because cooperation is all about showing kindness, mutual respect, compassion, tolerance, inclusiveness, all those virtues that we admire but don't always practice. They are part of what it means to be human. It means some other things as well, but at the core, the greatest asset humans have, the greatest asset in human nature, is this capacity for kindness. Now, so it's always there, but it does get elbowed aside by all sorts of ego-driven desires and competitive impulses and so on. But to come to that part of your question, when there's a crisis, whether it's societal, like bushfires or a pandemic or floods, or whether it's personal, like a relationship breakdown, a bereavement, a retrenchment, those are the moments when our truest nature is called out. That's when we become more truly ourselves. Now, I've mentioned in the book, some people said to me when I was working on this, But, you know, we were all really nice to each other during the Olympics in Sydney. Remember the Olympics when train guards would say, people are talking.
I smiled at a few people I didn't know at all.
Yeah. Extraordinary.
I know.
And they put their newspapers down. That was in the days when people bought and read newspapers. Do you remember what newspapers? They put their newspapers down and they're talking to each other. And then about 2 weeks after the Olympics, they said, no, they've stopped talking and they're back in the new. In other words, that was a dramatic disruption to our way of life that brought out the best in us for a fortnight. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a tragedy. Now, our folklore says we grow through pain, and it's a very inconvenient truth. We do seem to need disruptions, jolts, catastrophes, crises, to remind us of who we really are, to remind us of our common humanity. Pleasure, games, fun, carnivals, festivals don't seem to have... They have the capacity to bring out the best in us for a day or a week, or maybe a month, but the enduring development of our human nature seems to rely on adversity.
Yeah. You see that in the movies, actually, when there's an hour to go and it all seems well for the protagonist, you know something terrible is about to happen because it can't
Yes.
stay like this.
Yes.
So I was really interested that neuroscientists have found the cooperation centre, but in response, I would say, politics, thousands of years of wars, tribalism, all these things that are about competitiveness. That seems to be just as intrinsic to human nature as cooperation.
It does seem to be, and I'm arguing very strongly in this book that it's not. It's of course present, and we learn to compete. We're fast learners. We learn to compete most fundamentally for territory, and that goes back into our ancient origins. Compete for food, perhaps compete for sexual partners and so on. But that's not an innate, that's something created by circumstances. If we're not short of land or short of food or water or something, then it will be natural for us to develop a harmonious community. It won't always be harmonious, yes, there'll be bad apples, again the ego will rise up and people will behave badly and all that stuff. But war, adversarial politics, domestic violence, all of these, I mean, you could draw up a long list of the ugliness of human behaviour, but it would be absolutely overwhelmed, and the items on these are absolutely outnumbered by all the wonderful acts of kindness, charity, compassion that are performed unsung every day by humans who make this place work. If we were, in fact, typified by war or violence or envy or competitiveness of any kind, we'd have been extinct long ago. The fact that we've survived for all these hundreds of thousands of years says something to me about the fact that our innate kindness, our capacity for being kind even to people we don't like, people we could never agree with. I've quoted in the book the remark made by Samuel Johnson, written by Samuel Johnson 250 years ago. I'm not a devotee of Samuel Johnson, but this was a little gem. Kindness is in our power, even when fondness is not. In other words, we're not talking about emotion. We're not talking about affection.
You don't have to like someone.
We don't have to like someone to be kind to them. This is the purest form of human love, affectionless love. That just becomes a way of living, that we will treat people kindly. And it does, as I've acknowledged, get elbowed aside. But the fact that we've survived as a species, in spite of the wars, the violence, the competitiveness, all that sort of stuff, says to me that when the chips are down, we kindness prevails. When we're at the very brink of chaos, we pull ourselves back in the name of civilization.
I have to say, when I was reading this, I thought Hugh's got rose-tinted glasses here. But something you wrote in that chapter about politics, and you explore the idea of politics being more effective if it was less competitive. The thing that sort of struck me about it was that most of us are not engaged by politics, only maybe 10%. And I think the thing that turns most people off is how horrible it is, how horrible each side is to the other side. I wonder if they were nicer, maybe we'd all pay more attention.
Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind that the system that we've inherited and that we've often, defended and thought this is how democracies should work. Why? Democracies will work much better in a less adversarial environment. Ireland, the Republic, is famous for its violent adversarialism, for its bitter, divisive politics.
I married a woman from Northern Ireland, Hugh, so...
Right.
I should just assume
I married a woman from the Republic.
Yeah, well, there we go.
We won't get into this. What's happening in Ireland in 2020, 2021? The two main opposition parties in opposition have got together. They have devised a 20-year plan for Ireland's future against about 20 criteria, things like gender, climate change, employment, education, a long list. They've agreed on this, and part of their agreement is that they will take it in turns to be Prime Minister.
This is to keep Sinn Féin out, of course.
Well,
it is.
That's a cynical interpretation.
It is absolutely why they've done it.
Well, but these are the two major parties, and they play with them. Now, maybe that's a motivation. Nevertheless, they are demonstrating a different way of running a parliament in a democracy. And some other countries around the world do the same thing. I mean, we think the British model, the mother of parliaments, the mother parliament, is somehow the gold standard. Of course, it's not. I mean, built into the system is that we will be at each other's throats. Now, that made some sense when there were philosophical differences between the two sides of politics that were wide. Today, it's very hard to know. If you come up with a policy, it's very hard to know which party would have proposed that. I mean, they're shifting into each other's territory. Everyone wants to be in the centre. But the adversarial ethos continues, so it becomes ugly. It becomes personal and, fighting harder and harder over fewer and fewer major philosophical differences. Something closer to a genuine forum, I think, would re-engage us. I have no doubt. When people talk about, when Australians talk about politics now, mostly they roll their eyes and want to change the subject. Why is that? It is precisely for the reason that you've mentioned. It's because the spectacle is, generally speaking, ugly. There was a brief flurry of admiration. I mean, esteem for politicians, notice, has gone up in the last 12 months because politicians seem to listen to expert medical advice and offered us detailed instructions about how to act in ways that were consistent with that advice. That was all good. And there was no adversarialism about that. The opposition wasn't standing up saying, no, don't wear masks. For goodness sake, stay shoulder to shoulder, don't keep your distance. I mean, that would be ridiculous. So it wasn't about party politics, it was about leadership. And we had the National Cabinet. And that looked like a bit of a glimmer of hope that things could become more civilised. But of course, the opposition's kept fairly quiet during that period, and then later it's all broken out again because it wasn't a true national cabinet. It wasn't like a wartime cabinet where all sides of politics are included.
I'll come back to hope, because it's an important part of this book. In the next chapters, everyone's deepest need is to be heard. And it is really, a lot of it, not all of it, is about listening. So really listening. And it's not a trivial thing, it's a profound thing.
Yeah. If I had to identify the one change that we could make in the way we live, preferably starting tonight, but certainly starting tomorrow.
Or this week at least.
Yeah, this week, that would add significant momentum to the push for a kindness revolution. The one thing I would recommend is that we all pay more attention to our ability to listen, attentively and empathically. And why do I say that? I say it because the deepest human need is to be taken seriously, and the most potent symbol of the fact that I'm being taken seriously is that someone is listening to me. That's happening to me right now. This is a moving moment for me when there's a room full of people who are interested in what you and I have to say. This reassures us that we are being taken seriously. And when people ask questions later, we will attend carefully to their questions, and that will be an indication to them that we respect them, take them seriously, acknowledge their question, appreciate their contribution, all of that. That's what listening does. Listening is the most precious gift we can ever give anyone, because it says to them, I take you seriously enough to bother listening to you. And the flip side of this, Richard, is equally important to acknowledge, which is if I don't listen to you, or if I half listen to you, or if I'm just pretending to listen, without saying a word, I'm saying to you, I don't value you enough to bother listening to you. A message we would never put into words to a partner or a child or a neighbour, but which we actually say without saying it every time we fail to listen. So let's sharpen up not just our listening skills, but our emotional readiness to listen to another person's point of view, to recognise that it's our responsibility as kind humans to receive what someone is saying to us before we react to it. Whereas mostly the natural thing is, I'll just jump in with my reaction.
As you say that, I think all of us can feel the truth of it. But what we reward is the good talker rather than the good listener. We reward the glib and the witty and the quick and the definite. If I think of Donald Trump, he wasn't an articulate man, but he did have firm opinions about whatever he was firmly on at that very moment. And we don't reward the good listener.
Well, it depends who you mean when you say we, and it depends in what context you're talking about. Around the family dinner table, in the school classroom, across the back fence, at a neighbourhood picnic, we handsomely reward the good listener. We love the good listener because they are taking us seriously, and we come away from an encounter with a good listener feeling valued. Now, in the entertainment world, sure, the good talkers get rewarded, especially if they're witty or clever in some other way. That's a different thing. I think in terms of personal relationships, in the context of families, neighbourhoods, workplaces, schools, listening is highly valued, and no one. The fact that I gave an example, a highly personal example in the book.
About your mum.
My mother, who was a renowned listener. I mean, she was the kind of woman who would go shopping and come home and talk about what someone had said to her at the bus stop. People just talked to her because she was a good listener, and she really did listen. But the exception was in the case of my father, who was a relentless talker. And she maintained a pleasant, patient look on her face. But a guest in our home once I heard saying to my mother, this when I was an adult, how do you put up with that? He never stops talking. And she said, I stopped listening years ago. So we should not assume that when we're talking, people are listening. If we are good talkers, then take a very close look in the mirror and see whether your good talking is getting in the way of your good listening.
You get into the importance and power of apologising here. And the harder bit, I think apologising is not too bad. I think forgiving is really hard. And especially It's hard enough to forgive someone for being wrong. It's just about impossible to forgive them for being right. But being generous with forgiveness, I don't think I'm the only person who will read this book and realise that they're not good at that. But there's an enormous power in being better at it.
Yeah, I've described listening, apologising and forgiving as the sort of holy trinity of expressions of our innate kindness. When we really adopt kindness as a default position, when we say, okay, regardless of the situation, even if I'm going to terminate a relationship, even if I'm going to terminate someone's employment, even if I'm going to have to go next door and complain to the neighbour about a barking dog or some other thing, I can do this kindly. I have to remember I'm human. And that calls on me to deal with this kindly so it won't be a damaging encounter. And the same goes for listening, apologising and forgiving. They are the classic expressions of human kindness. As you say, apologising does come more easily to most of us than forgiving, and yet there are some people who take it as a sort of article of faith that they will never apologise. I've known several people, I've quoted some in the book, who just would not apologise. An extraordinary failure to acknowledge the need of the other person for an apology to be made. If I've wronged you or offended you in some way, what you most desperately need as a sign that I value you is that I apologise. And when I've apologised, what I most desperately need as a sign that you value me is your forgiveness. Now, when we break through to what I've described in the book as radical kindness, the quality of kindness that will not be put off, then we won't even require an apology in order to forgive. But there is a beautiful symmetry between apology and forgiveness. And by the way, I mention this also in the context of Aboriginal reconciliation. It's an issue that we seem a bit embarrassed about raising, but I raised it here. All the emphasis so far is, as it should be, on the need for an apology for the appalling historical and contemporary treatment of our First Nations people. At some point, it is appropriate, I think, for us to consider whether it might be time for forgiveness. Because, as I've said a couple of times in the book, until we forgive, whatever the situation, whether it's on a huge scale like that or on a very intimate personal scale, as long as we withhold forgiveness, we are condemned to remain the victim. It's forgiveness that releases you from victimhood.
So I should be nicer about those boys in Year 9?
Yes.
I'm going to skip on because there's a lot in this and we can only touch on things and I'm sure that many of you will have really good questions and I want to leave space for them. There's a chapter, How Institutions Hold Us Together. When I got there, I thought this was going to be about the ABC, one of Australia's most important institutions, but it isn't at all. Of course it's not. Instead you're talking about language and manners and social conventions. How much do you think they're changing under kind of selective pressure of the pandemic?
They're certainly changing. But just to step back a bit, yes, but I do acknowledge, I do refer to public broadcasters in there. I don't know that I named the ABC or SBS, but Richard implied. Because institutions, of course, are a larger version of social conventions, whether they're legal institutions or educational or financial or cultural. They are, like I described it in the book, as the scaffolding that keeps society together, as does ordinary courtesies, manners, table manners. This is all part of society's scaffolding that encourages kindness by imposing some constraints on our behaviour. Now that changes under different circumstances. As we have become, over the last, I think, 25 or 30 years, a far more socially fragmented society, a far more individualistic kind of culture, we've seen an erosion of some of the things that we previously regarded as almost sacrosanct when it came to good manners, language, how it's appropriate to behave or dress or speak. When we have a culture of rampant individualism, people can do and say what they please, and if they can shock you, so much the better. It's a sort of an anti. Let's pull the scaffolding down. Let's not be constrained by any of these conventions. Now, under the influence of the pandemic, a whole lot of new conventions grew up, of course, because our way of living changed. I mean, we now have the Zoom culture. There's a whole new set of rules about how you behave. Preferably put all your clothes on, not just the bit that's visible in case you have to stand up and move away. And of course, unmute yourself became the cry of 2020 as people got to turn the sound on. So all these little kind of conventions, that's how social conventions emerge. But the other thing that I think was really interesting about the influence of information technology during the pandemic was it reminded us, it was brilliant, and it allowed us to maintain contact via phone, email, text, social media, and Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all these other platforms. Brilliant, but we were reminded, perhaps more forcibly than we would have been, more forcefully than we would have been without the pandemic, how deficient these things are.
Yeah.
That we were not making eye contact with people we could see on the screen, that the world is not in two dimensions. And in fact, people experiencing long Zoom sessions often referred to how tiring it was. And it was tiring because the brain has trouble switching between three-dimensional and two-dimensional reality. So if you're going to spend an hour talking intensely to someone on a screen in two dimensions, your brain is adapting to that, and then you come back into three dimensions, your brain adapts again. There is a phenomenon, now measurable, of brain fatigue associated with that kind of switching. So when we thought we were getting tireder in a 1 hour Zoom meeting than a real in-person 1 hour meeting, that was true. We were. So we learn all these things as we go, and I think that experience of living through the pandemic and social conventions being challenged or changed temporarily or permanently reminded us of how important some of the social conventions really are as part of the larger reminder that actually we are an indivisible whole. The pandemic, that rotten little coronavirus, it turned out, did not just attack Buddhists, did not just invade the bodies of one-legged immigrants. It's humans. And I think the understanding that we share a common humanity, recognised by the virus but sometimes forgotten by us, was a very important reminder that social conventions are very important, that creating social harmony is a primary responsibility of being a human, being a member of this species.
And there's no substitute for being in the room.
Yeah, no substitute for eye contact, for the ability to touch someone in a friendly way on the arm, for being in the same place at the same time.
Yeah.
That's how humans actually communicate, and everything else is a substitute.
We now come to the most cheerily titled chapter. Life is imperfect, it only resolves in death.
On the grounds that when you're dead, you're perfectly dead, and it's the only time anything is perfect.
There's a bit in here about your own incredibly interesting but imperfect life. And it made me think of something that I'm increasingly struck by, which is how important chance is, Hugh. That we tend to edit out chance when we're telling the story of our lives.
Yes.
But it's right there all the time, having an impact. And it did with you.
It certainly did. I mean, if I think of my career as a social researcher, that is completely accidental. I didn't know there was such a career until after I was working in it for some years for reasons that had nothing to do with the decision I made about it. It was a very, very lucky accident. Before I got that job, my school holiday job at the end of secondary school, selling pipes and tobacco in David Jones, was not a particularly lucky accident. It didn't lead on to a career in the retail of tobacco and pipes. But my first research job in January of 1955 did. But it was a sheer accident. And that reminds me, and that little lightning trip through my life in that chapter is another reminder, I think, of the fact that we often talk about decisions we've made, actions we've taken, as though they are rational.
Yes, how rational we've been.
And mostly, I think we can most easily explain what we've done and what other people have done by acknowledging that we are profoundly non-rational beings, and that things that we think of as decisions, that we sometimes make a decision. You know, my favourite brand of toothpaste is out of stock. I have to decide to buy another one. That's a decision. We might make deliberate choices like that, but most of what we think of as decisions turn out to be things that just happen, that kind of evolved. I describe, that really the first, or the years from roughly 20 to 40 in my own life, when I got married, divorced, many of my close friends died, I started my own business, all this, it's all like a fog. I can't tell you how any of that happened. I kind of went from thing to thing, and it seemed to happen to me rather than me making deliberate decisions. And in fact, in my own research, when I've asked people sometimes to talk about big life decisions, how did you end up marrying that person, or having that many kids, or doing that job, or people say, well, I can't really tell you. We never intended to have 3 kids. Not sure how it happened. I remember someone in one of those research projects saying, I was sick the day I was meant to enrol at university. I rang a mate and said, would you enrol for me? He said, oh, okay. And then just before he hung up, he said, what do you want to enrol in? And this bloke said, oh, what are you going to do? And he said, dentistry. Okay, I'll do dentistry. Now, that man could be drilling your teeth. And it's an accident.
The point of this is that, and I think this is really important, towards the end of the chapter, you say, try to remember that when you're kind of looking at other people and how stupidly they're behaving, how irrational they seem, that you're exactly the same.
Yes.
And that explains the act with some kindness there.
Yes.
Because it wouldn't be bad if they acted with a bit of kindness to you.
Yes, that's right. Let's acknowledge that it is in our nature. It is hard for us to be rational. We go through, let's say, 12 years of education and a bit of primary and secondary, and then perhaps a bit of tertiary on top, and learn how to do some things rationally, how to cross a road safely or build a bridge that won't fall down, and so on. But in our personal relationships, in our private lives, most of the time we are ruled by the heart far more than the head. And when people, the unkindest thing we could say, for example, to a partner is, why can't you be more rational? Because the only response to that is, the only true response to that is, because I'm human. If you wanted a computer, well, go and marry a computer. Humans aren't like that.
I'm going to skip ahead to the epilogue, joining the kindness revolution. And I had 2 thoughts as I got to the end. And the first was a super current one. It's about India, which is going through a catastrophe. And Australia, unlike other countries, is telling our citizens that they can't come home. And not only that, but if they try, they'll be fined, they'll be jailed. I think that's wrong.
So do I.
It's very far from kind. How big is the gap between what we could be and what we are?
Enormous. That's a huge current example. It's almost beyond belief that we would be talking about jailing and fining people who come back under these conditions. Yes, we should be testing them before they leave and testing them when they arrive, and we should be putting them in quarantine, all the things we do anyway with homecoming Australians. But the idea that if someone arrives from India at the moment, only India, not Brazil or
Not
Italy.
Not Aspen.
No.
If you come back from Aspen, I think you're okay.
Or if you're a cricketer coming home from India, the idea that they would be treated like this is outrageous, and it's urgent, and we get it. Now we just need to remind ourselves there are other things that are equally awful, like imprisoning people in offshore detention centres for an interminable period, an indefinite period that might be 10 years plus, for committing no crime, but simply seeking asylum in Australia. We've kind of got accustomed to that, but that's as outrageous as this proposal for people, Australian citizens returning from India. So there's a list of things that we should be outraged about, and we kind of, if it goes on for long enough, we become acquiescent. But it's another example, of course, of the point you were making earlier, that there is a gap between what people trying to be kind, decent, good citizens think is right, and what their political leaders, in quotes, sometimes decide to do.
The other thought I had was about the TV show You Can't Ask That, actually. Even when I'm convinced that I'll have no sympathy for the category, people who cheated, or I think the next one's about former footballers, or whatever it is, I am always wrong. Now, there's obviously the skill of the program maker here, but I'm always struck by the humanness of them, the humanity of them. I often find it moving. And I think there's something similar about what you're doing here. As well as the kind of relentless interest in the human condition, you're always pointing to the better angels of our natures here.
Well, I'm pointing to two things simultaneously. One is, yes, certainly to the better angel of our nature, we have this capacity, but also, as that program apparently reveals, from what you've told me, it's not a program I've viewed.
You should watch it.
There is in everyone the need to be understood. Can I just read something from the book that captures this better than I can? Is that a message we need to respond to?
I think you should bring it up to the front.
Everyone is in need of... It's not a fire alarm, is it? It's just everyone is in need of kindness, because everyone walks with shadows. The bereaved with their grief, the arrogant with their deep down insecurities, the believers with their doubt, the lonely with their ache for connection, the uncherished with their fear of insignificance, the ambitious with their vulnerability to failure, the siblings with their rivalry, the bullies with their repressed self-loathing, the errant with their guilt, the anxious and depressed with their dark yearnings, and all those living with the pain of disappointment, frustration, humiliation, rejection, or loss. Kindness is the universal balm for troubled souls, the gift that says, I understand the need for kindness because I share it. And that's perhaps what that program does, just makes you realise that they're like you.
I think you got all of us there with that list. I think that's also a good place for me to stop asking questions and for you to start asking them. So if you have a question, put your hand up and I will repeat it. On at the front.
Hello. Thanks for that, Hugh. Loved your thing on 702 earlier. Love this as well. I've got two questions, but I'll ask one to start with. You talk about kindness and almost a true version of altruism, where other thought processes may say that there is no true altruism because people do things only for some sort of self-gain, whether it's endorphins or some oxytocin or something like that. How do you reconcile those two sort of ideas? altruism is something which is not really true because we all get something out of it.
It's all self-interested in the end.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll repeat it for the stream.
Yes.
So the question is, how do you reconcile this idea of altruism? Isn't it really all self-interest eventually?
Yes, thanks for the question. No, it's not. There is such a thing as altruism, and it doesn't always release the endorphins that make us feel great. I've quoted the example in the book of a person who comes upon, I think it's an elderly person whose shopping bag it's raining, their shopping bag has burst and their shopping's all over the footpath. And so naturally, what does a human do? Helps pick it all up, get it all back together again. Having now got soaked and being late for an appointment, you don't feel better. You feel worse, but you still did the human thing. You still acted kindly. That was the right thing to do. Maybe in bed at night you might think, well, that was an incredible bit of drama there and it wrecked my day, but probably I did the right thing on balance. Or you probably won't even think that.
What if you skite?
Well, if you skite, it's dead. It's no longer virtuous. Then it is exactly what the questioner is saying. Then it is not altruism at all. It is self-serving. If someone's in trouble in the surf and you dive in and help them, bring them back to shore, they might be too exhausted to thank you, but it doesn't matter. You still did the right thing. You still saved their life. But then if you stand up and say, hey, look what I just did. See this person here I just saved? Everyone's going to be embarrassed and start catcalling. That's not virtue. That's self-aggrandizement. But I think that the difference... I'm a great believer in altruism as something that just happens all the time, all around us. People in this room today will have mostly, one way or another, performed acts of altruism without a second thought, and not for personal gain, not for the little kick they're going to get out of being nice to someone. You don't, a neighbour is in strife and they need help with shopping, so you do the shopping. It's any part of that to make yourself feel better, or is all of it to help the neighbour? I think all of it is to help the neighbour. And the person who is saying, the person who wants to brag about it is a person who's not acting kindly at all. That isn't altruism.
I'll just ask a supplementary to that, because actually you tackle this head on in the book, and you make the point that if you do this in a calculating way, it doesn't work. It doesn't give you that reward. If you say, I'm going to do this, feel fantastic,
yes.
It doesn't make you feel fantastic.
It has to be unconscious.
Yeah. Is there a... Oh, I'll get to you. In the glasses, yes.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. And you mentioned that one aspect of kindness is really the deep listening, the ability to develop that deep listening. I would be interested in your thought on what comes on the way for allowing that deep listening. Our education teaches us to be very rational and make decisions and judge. And judgment often gets on the way, I'd say. So we talk a lot about deep listening and developing empathy. I'd be interested in your thought on what stops us from doing this. What gets on the way?
The question is, what stops us from listening really, really actively and well? What gets in the way of that?
Well, I have gone into this in some considerable detail in the book, but let me just quickly capture the concept that I think, a metaphor that I think helps to explain this. Each of us, as we grow and mature, develops what I describe as a mind cage. It's invisible, of course, but it's like a little cage that comprises all our beliefs, all our convictions, all the things we think we know, all our expectations, our values, attitudes, all that. So it's like a framework, it's like a cage, but it's also a bit like a cocoon. We feel terrific inside it, very comfortable and secure with our own points of view, our own prejudices, our own attitudes, values, etc. So when we look out at the world, and in particular when we're listening to someone who's talking to us, the natural position for us is to see or hear what's going on out there through the pattern created by the bars of our own mind cage. So we impose our own prejudices on what we're hearing, and if what we're hearing contradicts what we think, we'll be so defensive that will actually reinforce our prejudices. I make the point in the book, if you really want to reinforce someone's prejudices, attack them, because they'll defend themselves and then they'll believe what they originally believed even more strongly. So here's the challenge, and I'm not suggesting, it's a bit like forgiveness, I'm not suggesting this is an easy challenge, because our ego would prefer to remain within the comfort and security of the mind cage. But the challenge for the person who's committed to kindness, the challenge for the person who wants to become an attentive and empathic listener, is to metaphorically step outside the comfort and security of their own cage. Tough enough, but here's the hard bit. Try to imagine what it's like to be in that other person's cage. Carl Rogers, who's one of my psychological heroes, a now dead American, a really original, creative, pioneering psychotherapist, he says listening is one of the most courageous acts we ever perform, because if we are to truly listen to the other, that means we will be running the risk of changing our minds. And no one likes to have to change their mind, because that seems as if they're admitting they were wrong, or the life lessons that they learned were not right. So the mind cage is a very, very powerful defence and inhibitor to good listening, a defence against good listening, inhibitor of good listening. But somehow we have to find the generosity of spirit to say, I know what I think, but my job as a listener is to discover what you think. And only when I discover what you think can I decide what I feel about that. We're so anxious. I mean, watch people having an argument. Generally speaking, all they're doing is trading blows. No one's stopping and saying, hang on, are you really saying this? Have I got this straight? Imagining what it's like, entertaining the ideas of the other person is the key to empathic listening. And look, I'm making it sound as though it's a huge challenge, and it is hard in the beginning, but you can learn it very easily. I mean, you can learn it in a week. It's not, once you recognise what you have to do, I've got to set I'm going to listen. I'm not just going to pretend to listen, I'm actually going to entertain these ideas. I might then say, this is complete rubbish, I could never buy any of it, I'm appalled. I mean, I had someone in my own home a year ago, they have been back, by the way, it made it sound, who said to me with a straight face, I think Peter Dutton is our only hope. I was the host. So I had to tread very carefully, but I mean, I've had subsequent discussions with that person, and so I know what her past is, where she came from, how she comes to have that kind of view. She knows I don't agree with her, and she knows that we're better off talking about her dog rather than politics. But at least now we know where we stand, and that's a lot healthier than just saying, sorry, I don't know how I did that, staying comfortable within our own prejudices. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded.
So there's another question at the front here.
Hugh, thank you very much, and Richard, thank you. I'm just wondering whether there's such a thing as a kindness index. Are there some acts of kindness that have a greater societal impact than others? What should we be bothered with? And I'm thinking of Jacinta Ardern and her talk of kindness, and that's something that really has a profound impact on us as observers, or the New Zealanders as citizens of that country.
So is this, I love this, is there such a thing as a kindness index? And actually, would there be any value in it?
This is a most extraordinary question, because I am at the moment consulting with an organisation who's trying to figure out a way to measure a national kindness index. And it may be possible, I think it'd be easier to come up with that than with a national happiness index, which is a waste of effort. But look, I think the problem about trying to come up with some measure of it is that there are acts of kindness that are so incidental almost. You know, someone dropped something and we pick it up, that's an act of kindness. You pass someone in the street and you say, hello, terrific day, don't you love autumn? That's an act of kindness, because that might have been the moment when that person was in despair. And suddenly someone smiled at them and said something that made them feel, gosh, I was taken seriously, even if just for a moment. That's an act of kindness. All the way up to, I took a homeless person into my house overnight while I helped them find proper accommodation, or I cooked a meal for a neighbour who was unwell. They're acts of kindness. So clearly we can talk about a scale of kindness from relatively straightforward to very complex and very self-sacrificial. But I would never describe any act of kindness as trivial. I think that the wave to a stranger who you pass in your street, or giving directions to someone who's lost, or hanging on to a lost child until its parents can be found. I mean, these are not grandiose things, but they're highly significant in creating a kinder society. Whether we will ever succeed in distilling all of that into an index that says when it comes to kindness, Australia is 7.2 out of 10 compared with New Zealand, I don't know.
Good question, Bud.
So I think there's, I just want to follow in some ways from that. There seems to be a bit of a contradiction in the behaviour of Australians. I think that our cooperation with the lockdowns had kindness in it. I wasn't just in a lockdown and accepting that to look after myself. I was also trying to ensure that I didn't affect other people. And particularly the 20-something-year-olds who didn't really think they'd ever suffer at the time. They were being kind because they were looking after others by conforming. On the other hand, I've worked in a university where many of the students I've spoken to, and when I talk to them about refugees, said, well, they're illegals. And they were afraid to have connection with people who wore hijabs or had come from Iraq or Iran as refugees. And I'm wondering, I mean, so why is there this conflict, this conundrum between are Australians kind or not kind, and when are they kind and when are they not kind? And one of my question there really is, what does our leadership do when they tell lies about illegals, create an illegality which is not an illegality, and then press this on us? Yeah.
So this is a question about the human condition, about how we can be both kind and very unkind at the same time, and especially when we're encouraged to, by people with interests in being cynical. We skip the cynicism chapter, Hugh, because of time, but it's right in the middle of it.
Yes, thank you for this, and obviously this is a reality we're all very familiar with, and I'm glad you mentioned the word leadership, because if we go back even into our own recent history, thinking of both sides of politics, Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke as Prime Ministers offering leadership on the subject of how we should respond to, in particular, Vietnamese boat people, what a contrast with subsequent leadership rhetoric. So if political leaders say these people are illegal immigrants, then in the absence of counter-argument, people will just accept that that's illegal. I mean, Joseph Goebbels, no less, said whoever tells the world first is believed. So if they're illegals, they're illegals. It requires a bit of knowledge of the situation and a bit more thought to say, well, actually, no, they're not illegal. And the voices contradicting that were less voluble, less audible, I should say, than the voices of political leaders who made those completely irresponsible, outrageous, illegal, you might say, claims about these refugees. So leadership has a huge part to play in a situation like that. The other thing that would, of course, change it would be personal connections. So if someone's sister falls in love with a refugee, it all changes. We get to know the person. Yeah, people will say, I remember my own father, it was a bit about parents coming up tonight, my own father was virulently anti-Catholic, and his closest friends were Catholics. He's what's known as a human.
I think we'll have one more. There's one down the back. You, sir, yes. No, sorry, somebody in front of you. I saw them first, I'm sorry.
Hugh, it's hard to not bring gender into it, really, because if you look in the room and if you look about the helping sector in society, women are very much the ones carrying that load. In Parliament, we see the reverse, really. We see primarily men, and except for Western Australia, it would be interesting to see what happens in Western Australia, but interesting to get your thoughts.
So briefly, are women just kinder than men?
I never dare to make a generalisation like that. I mean, the older I get and the more I try to wrestle with that particular question, the more I'm driven to the conclusion that it is probably the case that most men are slightly better than most women at judging distance. Full stop. Humans are capable of kindness. Humans, most spectacularly, are capable of kindness to strangers. I think that's the most beautiful thing about us. Are women more spontaneously inclined to be kind to strangers than men? All I'll say is some women are and some men are. I wouldn't dare make that generalisation. And if I'm still around in another 15 years, which that's more or less, very unlikely, the answer to that question would be even more fluid than it is now, because that revolution has gathered some fresh momentum.
We might get one more in down the back in the green.
This is following on, actually, coincidentally on the question about women. I'm going back to your story about your mother, which I really like. And whilst your mother wasn't listening empathetically, according to you, and according to her, she at least wasn't saying to him, why don't you keep quiet, you old windbag? She was being kind, wasn't she?
Yeah.
Isn't that the ultimate sort of kindness in a relationship? Not to sort of go back and say, will you shut up?
Yeah.
That's pretty kind, isn't it?
So,
and it's not listening empathetically.
So the question is, isn't the ultimate kindness in a relationship not to say, be quiet, you old windbag?
I love that question. And of course, you're right. And my mother was an inspiring example of a kind human. And yes, she was remarkably tolerant of my father, who was a very difficult man. So that was an act of great kindness and compassion. Even though she laughed at herself for not listening, there was a larger truth, and you've drawn it out. Thank you.
I think that's where we'll leave it. Thank you very much, Hugh.